In our last video, we described at a very high level how GTO strategies are constructed. In this video, we will focus on how theory deals specifically with one of the most important and difficult aspects of poker, bluffing. So to start off, recall that in our last video we mentioned that in any given scenario, usually you can't just bluff your weak hands 100% of the time because you'll end up bluffing way too much. So you need to be selective about when you bluff by choosing combos based on their specific characteristics. You could think of this as a two-step process. First, you consider how often you should be bluffing in a particular spot, and then you decide whether to choose your specific hand to bluff with based on a consideration of probabilities. The first step of this process is generally driven by two primary questions. Which player is more likely to have the strongest hand, and does villain have a high likelihood of holding a weak hand? The player who has the higher probability of holding the strongest hand is more likely to get folds with his bluffs. And if villain has a high likelihood of holding a weak hand, he's more likely to fold when facing a bet. So in other words, the answers to these questions determine how often we should be bluffing overall in a given spot. To explain further, let's take a look at an example. Let's say that we're on the button holding Jack 9 of diamonds and we raise pre-flop and the big blind calls. The flop comes King 7 deuce rainbow. What should the big blind do? Well, as mentioned, the first part of our two-step process is to consider how often we should be bluffing, which is determined primarily by who is more likely to hold the strongest hand and what the likelihood is of villain holding a weak hand. And we can use game theory programs to help train our ability to answer both of these questions. For those unfamiliar, what you're looking at is a GTO program which tells us for a given scenario how each player should play all of his possible hands to maximize chips across all possible runouts and actions of the players. In this particular case, we're looking at the GTO strategy for the big blind on the flop. On the left, we have a graphical depiction of all the possible hands the big blind is likely to have based on his prior actions, also known as his range. And on the right are all the hands the button is likely to have based on his prior actions. So, for example, since the button raised pre-flop, it's very possible that he has a hand like pocket aces or ace king, but it's unlikely he raised with a hand like 7 deuce off. And a hand like Jack 8 off is probably somewhere on the borderline, which is why this cell is only partially shaded, because the probability of the button raising with this particular hand pre-flop is not quite 100%. And on the flip side, because the big blind simply called the raise pre-flop, it's unlikely that he has a hand like aces or ace king, but very likely he has a hand like pocket fours. So based on this, which player is more likely to hold the strongest hand? Well, right below these grids are bar charts which categorize all the possible hands from above into classes by their strength. So in this case, the button has a higher probability of holding a set, two pair, overpair, and top pair. And when the opponent is much more likely to hold the strongest hand, particularly when we're out of position, playing passively overall will usually be warranted, which is graphically depicted by this last row. This row shows how often the big blind should be taking each possible action in this scenario. So in other words, in this spot, button versus big blind, in a single raise pot on a King 7 deuce rainbow board, regardless of the big blind's specific holding, he should be checking 100% of the time. Now let's move on to the button's decision after the big blind checks. As we just established, the button has a much higher likelihood of holding the strongest hand. What about the likelihood of the big blind holding a weak hand? Well, it's significant. The big blind has an over 40% chance of holding a hand that is weaker than ace high. The combined effects of these two dynamics means that the button should be leveraging this probabilistic advantage to play very aggressively. In this case, betting nearly 100% of the time, including with virtually all bluffing candidates. Now let's assume that the button bets small here, the big blind calls, and the turn is the queen of diamonds, and the big blind checks again. Now we're looking at the hands both players are likely to have on the turn based on the pre-flop and flop action. And at each and every decision point, we start our analysis all over again. So who is more likely to hold the strongest hand? Well, it's still likely to be the button, because he's more likely as the pre-flop aggressor to hold aces, kings, queens, and king-queen, both suited and offsuit. But as to the likelihood of the big blind holding a weak hand, the answer has significantly changed from the flop. Because the big blind called the button's flop bet, it means that the likelihood of him holding complete trash on the turn is much lower because he should have folded most of his air on the flop. Accordingly, overall, the frequency of how often the button should continue barreling on this turn is also much lower, which means we now need to move on to the next stage of our analysis to determine whether we should bluff our specific hand. But before we do that, let's pause for a moment to sum up the first stage of our bluffing analysis by creating a general heuristic. If in a given spot, the opponent is much more likely to hold the strongest hand, you can usually check most or all the time, particularly when out of position. But if you are much more likely to hold the strongest hand and your opponent is very likely to hold a weak hand, you can usually bet/bluff most of the time. In most other scenarios, such as when it's unclear who's likely to have the strongest hand, or when villain is not very likely to have a weak hand, hero will generally want to bet/bluff some of the time and check some of the time. And in that case, the next step of our analysis is to determine whether to bluff our specific holding based on its specific characteristics, and there are 3 primary factors that should be influencing this decision from a GTO perspective. 1. Showdown value, 2. Incremental equity, and 3. Card removal. Showdown value generally refers to the likelihood of our holding winning the pot, assuming that the game ends immediately. So a flush has a higher showdown value than a pair, and a pair has higher showdown value than ace high, and ace high has higher showdown value than king high, and so on and so forth. Generally speaking, the lower the showdown value our hand has, the more inclined we should be to bluff it. Recall that in our last video we mentioned that GTO's sole function is to take the actions that will maximize chips on average. When deciding between betting and checking, the lower the showdown value of our hand, the lower the amount of chips we'll likely win by playing passively through checking, which in turn means that in order for bluffing to be the action that wins the most chips, the threshold will be relatively low. For example, if we look at the frequency of betting, represented by red, orange, and yellow, compared to the frequency of checking, represented by green, there's a distinct pattern that emerges among the various hand classes we're likely to hold in this spot. The classes of hands that bet most often are the strongest hands, which is no surprise, and our weakest hands with the lowest showdown value. These hands in the middle are predominantly checking. This is due in part to the fact that the number of chips these middling hands can win by playing passively to showdown is higher relative to the number of chips the weakest hands can win by playing passively to showdown. For example, the average number of chips a hand like Jack-4 of hearts is expected to win by checking is only 0.6 big blinds, whereas the average number of chips a hand like pocket nines is expected to win is much higher, 5.3 big blinds. This means that the threshold for betting to be the play that is likely to win the most chips is much higher for pocket nines than it is for Jack-4 of hearts. Or in other words, bluffing with Jack-4 of hearts only needs to win us chips a small amount of the time to be the play that maximizes our chips on average. Now let's talk about our second factor, incremental equity, which generally refers to the qualities of a hand that make it more likely to make a stronger hand on a later street. This can be in the form of a draw to a flush or straight, or to a lesser extent, a draw to a strong pair, 2-pair, or trips. So if we isolate our weakest hands, we see that a pattern also emerges with respect to the button's likely hands that have a draw and that don't have a draw. Hands with a draw are bet with much higher frequency, proportionally compared to hands without a draw, and the type of draw also influences bluffing frequency based on the strength of the draw, with combo draws betting nearly 100% of the time, and gut shots betting at a much lower frequency. And as for the last factor, card removal, let's take it to the river where incremental equity is no longer relevant, since, as a general matter, incremental equity is more important than card removal, because the former alters the likelihood to win much more significantly than the latter. So let's assume that on the turn we bet our Jack-9 of diamonds with the combo draw, the big blind called, and the river is a 3 of spades. The big blind checks. What do we do? Well, this card is a brick, as it doesn't really change much in terms of which player is more likely to hold the strongest hand. So let's skip right to the second stage of our analysis. With no further streets to come, the only relevant factors are showdown value and card removal. As for showdown value, we see a similar pattern to the turn, where the hands in the middle are mostly checked, and bluffs are primarily coming from the weakest hands. However, if we look at the GTO recommendation for our particular hand, Jack-9 of diamonds, we see that it is to check 100% of the time. So why is this? Well, it all comes down to card removal. As you may recall from our last video, card removal refers to the fact that when we are holding a particular card, it makes it impossible for our opponent to hold the same card, which changes the likelihood of whether our opponent is holding a stronger or weaker hand. In the case of bluffing, we want to select combos to bluff with that increase the probability that our opponent is holding a weaker hand. So in this case, let's think about the most likely hands that the big blind could have called bets pre-flop, on the flop, and on the turn, but would likely fold on the river. One likely hand would be Ace-X of diamonds, which may have floated the small bet on the flop and turned the nut flush draw. Other possible hands could be Ace-Jack or Ace-10 that had a draw to the nuts on the turn, or Jack-10, particularly with the backdoor flush draw. Having missed their flush and straight draws, a third barrel by the button would likely cause villain to fold these types of hands in this spot. So with that in mind, in the button shoes, from a card removal perspective, we don't want to be holding a card that prevents or blocks our opponent from holding one of these busted draws. And our combo, Jack-9 of diamonds, makes it impossible for villain to hold Ace-9 of diamonds, and some combos of Ace-Jack and Jack-10, which in turn means our holding lowers the probability that villain has a hand that will fold, and therefore it is not a good candidate to bluff with. A better candidate would be something like 10-9 of hearts, which doesn't block the big blind's diamond draws and only blocks some Ace-10 and Jack-10 combos. And this process of differentiating and prioritizing similarly situated hands based on their specific characteristics is essentially how all close, theoretically driven decisions are made, and the best players in the world are the ones that can accurately assess each player's range and perform this type of analysis quickly. But knowing which hands are better bluffing candidates compared to others is only part of the equation. We also need to know where to draw the line between the types of hands we bluff with versus check. Do we bluff our top 10% of bluffing candidates, top 50%, top 75%? To answer this question, we need to bring things full circle and revisit our first stage of analysis, which tells us how aggressive we should be overall. So to frame our bluffing analysis as an overarching heuristic, in every single situation where you're considering whether or not to bluff, you should first think about which player is more likely to be holding the strongest hand and the likelihood of villain holding a weak hand to determine your overall level of aggressiveness. And then, unless you're bluffing 100% of the time or 0% of the time, you should prioritize choosing to bluff hands that have lower showdown value and that have some form of incremental equity and or that have a higher probability of causing villain to fold due to card removal. To draw an analogy, you could think of the first step of this process as determining the size of your betting/bluffing bucket. In certain scenarios, this bucket will be very big, and in other scenarios, the bucket will be very small. Usually, it will be somewhere in between. And then in the next step, you fill up this bucket in order of the hands that have the best specific characteristics for bluffing. In other words, the threshold for which of your bluffing candidates make the cutoff to bluff will be heavily impacted by how big your bluffing bucket is overall. If the bucket is big, you can usually bluff with both strong and weaker bluffing candidates. But if the bucket is small, you should generally be more selective with the hands you bluff with and prioritize your strongest bluffing candidates. So for example, let's go back to the turn, but instead of the turn being the queen of diamonds, let's say it's the deuce of diamonds. In this case, from our first stage of analysis, it's not so clear that the button has the higher probability of holding the strongest hand because, in part, it's much more likely that the big blind is holding a deuce as a pre-flop caller. And with the big blind much more likely to have trips, it diminishes the strength of many of the button's value combos, which in turn means that we can't bluff as much because our bluffs need to be correlated to our value bets for purposes of balance. Accordingly, on this turn, the betting/bluffing bucket for the button is going to be significantly smaller compared to the queen turn, which means that the threshold for the quality of hands that we will want to bluff with generally should be higher. So in this case, maybe we decide to only bluff our strongest flush draws, but not our weaker ones, even though we don't have any straight draws to pull from. And what happens if the turn is the deuce of hearts instead of the deuce of diamonds? Well, this card is, for the same reasons, more favorable to villain, so our overall level of aggression should be similarly depressed. But here, we have no draws available. Does it mean that we don't bluff? No, in GTO, if we have any value bets, we must also have bluffs. So the fact that we don't have great bluffing hands just means that we need to dig down even deeper on our list of possible bluffing candidates, this time relying principally on card removal. So in this case, maybe, for example, we choose to bluff with a hand like Ace-6 of hearts because we would not be blocking a hand that the big blind may have floated the flop with against the small bet like 9-6 or 8-5 of spades, which had the double backdoors. Now, before we end this video, we should note that the factors we just discussed aren't the only ones to consider when bluffing, and therefore you will find that sometimes the GTO strategies produced by solvers will not neatly fit within our heuristics. For example, GTO will often spread out its bluffs among many different types of hands instead of allocating bluffs linearly based solely on incremental equity, because doing this provides better board coverage, allowing hero to make a strong hand no matter how the runout goes. Also, GTO may sometimes prioritize bluffing hands with lower incremental equity over hands with higher incremental equity, usually when there's a significant risk of villain raising. But for those that are new to GTO, it probably isn't wise to get too caught up in these exceptions, especially if you're playing live or at lower to mid stakes. Remember, our real life opponents aren't clairvoyant like solvers, and we aren't playing the same hand against them billions of times over. So the same considerations that the computer must take into account when devising its strategies aren't going to be as important against most of our real-life opponents. The most important factors that you should be considering in all bluffing scenarios are the ones we highlighted in this video.